Great. Meeting is being recorded too, so feel free to keep your videos off if you don't want your face on the screen. Otherwise, yeah. Hey, Bonnie, nice to see you.
Yes, hi. I had to push mute instead.
Okay, I'm just going to set up my screen here to make sure that everyone can see it. So just hang on for a second. Okay. Can you see that okay?
All good.
Wonderful. Is it lagging at all? I'm getting a bit of lagging on my side.
A bit
Is it
of lag
coming
on
through
your
clear?
cursor, but the screen is clear.
Okay. Wonderful. Let me know if that changes at all. My computer can be kind of slow sometimes, and worst case scenario, I can hand it over to you, Kamaya, to share.
For sure.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Welcome again. This video is being recorded so that for those who can't make it to the call, we've got a recording here. But this is the part 2 and part 3 of our talk on disrupting drug development through our new stakeholder-funded model. So we're having to put together part 2 and part 3 because last week's we had some confusion with the Zoom links. So sorry about that. But nonetheless, we'll make sure we get to all of the content today. If you have any questions throughout the talk, please feel free to jump into the chat. And maybe while I'm talking, Kamaya, if there's any good point, feel free to just bring up a question, and I can do the same for you. So without any further ado, let's get into it. There we go. Okay. So just a quick reminder, this is a partnership, what we're talking about, between TheraPsil and Hippo. So for anyone who's new, TheraPsil, we're a nonprofit. We've been a global leader in training research and grassroots advocacy, and our 4-pillar mission follows that same line: advocating for compassionate access, community education, professional education, and patient-centered research. And then through Hippo, we're running the world's, or I guess what I know of, the world's first stakeholder-funded clinical research trials for psilocybin. What we're trying to do is democratize access to research by enabling patients and stakeholders to fund clinical research and lowering costs of that research. So last week or 2 weeks ago, we talked about some of the issues with stakeholder-funded research and why it's expensive. So again, to kind of talk about how we got into this, for a couple of years now, TheraPsil has been doing Section 56s and SAPs. These are the 2 really only legal ways to access psilocybin outside of clinical trials. Now, the problem was that we were being denied access by the minister. And in cases where there was access granted, either through Section 56 or SAP, sometimes we were up against $5,000 in cost. And that might be the cost after you purchase the drug, have a doctor support you on SAPs, and then also go through a lot of the trouble. That can be legal trouble or just having to submit applications. But all in all, the costs were expensive. It was time consuming. And the biggest cost for most people was the 6-month wait, which they couldn't afford. So it was really impossible to get a clinical trial going. At least we thought so. But that all changed when Health Canada asked us to do a clinical trial that was stakeholder funded. So just a little bit of a recap from last week. What we're trying to do is challenge the funding norms. So, psychedelics are at a very pivotal moment right now. However, the clinical research just isn't keeping up. Now, last week we were talking and kind of criticizing some of the traditional pharmaceutical research a lot of it is very slow. It's almost always focused on the marketable drug products that these psychedelic research companies have. And that really typically leads to this kind of siloed approach where, what one company is doing, the other company isn't supporting them. So a lot of people at different organizations all doing their own research. And what it doesn't do is lead a unified psychedelic research front that might try to legalize or regulate psilocybin, MDMA, LSD. There's also a bit of a problem too with when companies get DINs. We don't really know what that means. So, that might be a company like Resilience, formerly Lycos or MAPS, getting a DIN for MDMA. We don't know what access will look like under that model. Will therapy be tied to the drug access? How much will it cost? These are all kind of question marks. And so for a grassroots organization such as ourselves and our members, patients, and practitioners, it would be really great if we had a bit more certainty. And so that's what we want to work towards. So what we really want to change is we want stakeholders. Those stakeholders are you, they are patients. We want them to be taking part in research, helping with the design and better understanding where our research is taking us. So really the problem, what it gets back to, is the traditional funding model, the model that so many pharmaceutical companies use in order to run this clinical research. It's always based on who's funding the research and what are their goals, never the goals of the end patient. They care much more about future profits than patient outcomes. And so for that reason, a lot of these clinical trials are really expensive because their goal is not to fail, and it's to ensure that at the end of the day, their drug product gets to market. So the future of legal psychedelic access, we believe, needs to be in the hands of patients. It needs to be in the hands of stakeholders. We want those stakeholders to be the ones who own the DIN, who own the information, and at the end of the day can work together in order to push research forward. This may kind of sound, like it might not be possible or too good to be true, but what we'll be talking about today in the webinar is exactly that model, how we make it work. So the stakeholder solution, again, I want to name who stakeholders are. Perhaps in the example that we'll be giving later and in today's talk, it is primarily patients. It's the patients, the many patients who might join a clinical trial who are going to be fronting, most of the time, the largest cost of that trial. Their payments will go to the therapy they receive, to the drug product they receive, and the participation in the study. However, stakeholders can also include the clinicians who are taking part, so the principal investigator and the therapists, and it can also include the community, which in this case might be nonprofits, members of nonprofits, donors, philanthropists, and clinics, and perhaps clinical partners. So really the whole community of people who put together a clinical trial. Now, when stakeholders are funding research, it really does bridge the gap between the academic side of research and the commercial scalability. It allows for stakeholders, these patients, to do research for the reasons that they deem necessary. And many times that is in order to get access to the psychedelics or drug products that they want. Now, when stakeholders are funding research as well, it allows them to design it. It's kind of like, follow the money. Whoever is paying for the project gets to design the project. And thus they can design what they want to research and also how the research might benefit right from the beginning to the end. And so all of a sudden, this research, by its now new nature, becomes accountable to the participants, not to some far off shareholders that want a return on profit. And so let's really just quickly talk about, one example of that is perhaps in traditional research, their goal is to get as much of their drug product to patients as possible, and perhaps even reduce those patient outcomes in hopes that they might be able to increase drug product and lower, patient outcomes. In research designed by stakeholders, they might want to see the best possible patient outcomes, the least amount of drug use, and most likely, they'll want to do research on the drug products that they're interested in, such as psilocybin, instead of other analog psychedelics that people may not have heard of, or other drugs that don't get to the root issue. So we're really taking the formation and design of research and putting it into the hands of both ourselves and patients. So let's talk about how this works. In order to do that, I want to go back to the beginning, because the very first instance that we heard of a stakeholder-funded project or clinical trial was an N of 1 study. That was Health Canada suggesting that we do a single clinical trial for a single patient. And that obviously begged the very first question of who was going to pay for that. When it was Health Canada that told us that a patient could fund that, then we thought, okay, well, if that's a single patient study, what about a multi-patient study? Yes, patients can pay for it. And so really what happens is our first point here, the patients are paying to participate. They're the ones who are contributing all of the money towards the trial that goes to pay for the therapist's time, the principal investigator's time, the clinical research coordinator's time, all of these components of the clinical trial. Now, the clinicians and investigators that lead the study as well can help bring the costs down. So when participants are paying for access to the study, they're paying, the clinicians and investigators, just like it would happen in a clinical setting, except this time the ownership of that data now belongs to those same clinicians, investigators, and patients. This data can now be used, developed, and, as we'll explain later, grown in order to drive policy change and perhaps even bring drug development forward. So in a way, research begets more research. Patients join the studies, they pay for the cost of the clinical trial. The investigators are able to take that data, present it to academia, present it to politicians to drive policy, and they'll get feedback, and that can result in more research and a continued cycle that gets paid for. So obviously there's some really, really key advantages of this, and democratizing research is the best one. We're able to put research and what wants to be researched into the hands of far more people. And this is I would say, pretty vast change from what is happening right now, where it is the few planning and designing clinical research that shapes policy for the many. We want it kind of to go the other way, where many clinicians are able to run clinical research and drive policy for the many. This could also, we believe, accelerate drug discovery. So as we start diversifying research, let's use, for example, in the field of psilocybin or MDMA, we can also ask a lot more questions. So what we've seen in the market today is a lot of focus on, say, MDMA for PTSD or psilocybin for major depressive disorder. These are intentionally very narrow and focused because they have one goal, and that is get to a drug approval as soon as possible. However, that again is because the shareholders funding that drug discovery, and they want to see return on their investment as soon as possible. When it's the stakeholders funding the research, there's not as much as an insistence on getting to drug approval as soon as possible. So instead, we can ask many different research questions. We can see if psilocybin might be effective for things like alcohol use disorder. We can dive deeper into things like the safety of the drug. We can expand exploration on how much therapy should be done before and after the treatment. We can also remove a lot of the delays that we normally see in research. So a lot of the research being done is waiting on new rounds of fundraising. That has actually sometimes slowed down research by years, waiting for donors or philanthropists to come around. Again, we get to do research at the speed at which there are patients who demand it. So if there are people today who need access to psilocybin or MDMA through a clinical trial and are willing to pay today, then the funding is there today to run that trial. So really what we're seeing is supply and demand. The researchers supply the opportunities to take part in research, and the patients with demand to join those studies pay for it. We also finally get to build what I believe are truly sustainable research operations that are based on trust between the participants of those studies and the researchers. Now, there's something I should mention here too, and that is research is expensive. And we didn't cover this, I believe, on this slide. But something that has to happen too in research is we need to see some of the costs come down. When we first got into these research studies, we were being quoted by clinical research organizations that traditionally would run pharmaceutical studies. And a lot of the margins that they were operating on were ridiculous and wouldn't allow for this sort of research. Just as an example, we were getting quotes to submit Section 56 applications, which are quite similar to SAPs. It's just a letter to the minister, or in this case to Health Canada, requesting a Section 56, so an exemption for the place where the psilocybin will be used. We saw some companies charging, tens of thousands of dollars for these forms. And what we knew from, the advocacy work we had done in the past is that these things are not expensive. In fact, the entire model was very much built on a small number of sales each year to drive a few projects, but those projects needing to feed big teams that were running research. So as we increase the speed at which research can run, we can achieve what in economics we call economies of scale. So being able to finance a clinical research study by continuously helping people through the study instead of smaller studies that may only happen once a year or might work with very few patients that don't actually cover the cost of the study. So what we were able to do by...
Sorry? Oh, awesome. Thanks.
Sorry, just a reminder to mute yourself too. I think I'm getting someone's mic there. So when we're able to run clinical research at scale, it becomes possible.
Let me just open the notes.
Sorry. Just a reminder to mute yourselves there, everyone. Awesome. So when we run clinical research at scale, we are able to drive down the costs. And just as an example, the first study that we've run, we were able to bring the cost down from what was initially quoted at about $30,000 per patient down to about $3,000 per patient, all just through these economies of scale by running larger research projects instead of smaller ones.
Hi, folks. Just looking at the chat here, Michelle, Sylvie, and Tracy, can you please mute your mics? It's Michelle Driver, Sylvie Peliquin, and Tracy L. If you could mute your mics. Thanks so much, folks. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Yaz. Okay. So I won't jump too much into the proof of concept here because Kamaya is going to be chatting in a couple moments about the TheraPsil clinical trial or the PsilWell clinical trial. But this is an example or a wonderful example of a trial that can be run at cost where patients are paying. And there are great examples of how we're also able to format that research in a very different way that you might have seen happening in current research and literature on psilocybin. So really what our goal and large scale vision is we want to see hundreds of clinical trials all over Canada, perhaps the US and the world, all working together and openly sharing data that allows people to build research on top of research. There's no reason that a researcher from Toronto shouldn't be perfectly willing and able to share their data with a researcher from Vancouver, compare notes, and then build a study on top of that. Again, the problem always is when we see research as a means to IPs, intellectual property, a means to a patent. When that happens, we separate, we work in silos. Through a stakeholder-funded model, all IP, all of the data belongs to the patients. It belongs to the people. And so we're able to all do research together for the sake of research, for the sake of supporting patients in a way that pays for the clinicians, it pays for the therapists, it pays for the researchers. So everyone gets paid. The patient gets the access that they were looking for and research gets done. It keeps prices low and it keeps access very broad and democratized. That's really what we want to see, is the development of psychedelic research and literature that is in the patient's and practitioners' best interests, and that drives drug development and regulation forward. So we really do believe that we can achieve this. And everything that I've talked about here is present in the existing trial that we have, our PsilWell trial on wellness. Just as a final point here, through this model too, one really important distinction that I want to make is this is not a marathon, or this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. So there is no drive to do this quickly. It can be done at the pace that best fits researchers and clinics and those who want to get involved. And we can always leapfrog off of developments too. So as this grows, it grows for everyone. Protocols can be shared and research becomes evergreen. In our model, we really want to see the funds that are generated by research seed future research projects so that we can further meet stakeholder needs. All right, I should probably move forward here. So we'll now jump on to part 3, which is Kamaya discussing her project, the PsilWell clinical trial. Kamaya, I might hand over the screen share to you if that's possible.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
I sent you a request, so I should be able to.
And I
share
got it.
afterwards.
I might just stop sharing for a moment to see if you can.
Is everyone able to see this?
Yes.
Awesome. So hello, everyone. My name is Kamaya Lawrence. I'm the Clinical Research Director at Hippo, working with TheraPsil towards what I'll be speaking about today, which is the PsilWell clinical trial. PsilWell stands for psilocybin for wellness. And this clinical trial is exploring, we're trying to ask the question, how does psilocybin-assisted group therapy affect wellness? And this is an active clinical trial happening in Victoria, BC. So I thought we would start off with what is wellness. I think there's a lot of definitions that are swirling around, but what does it actually mean? So we decided to turn to one of the largest health bodies internationally, the World Health Organization, the WHO. And in 1948, they defined wellness as a state of physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And this was a really interesting take because this showed that health is different from wellness. Wellness is a dynamic, shifting, and subjective state of being that doesn't necessarily have to do with if you are ill or not. They further expanded on this in 2006 by saying that wellness is the realization of the fullest potential of an individual physically, psychologically, socially, spiritually, and economically. These domains of wellness are really important and really shape a lot of the measurements of quality of life that we have today. They also elaborated to say that wellness is the fulfillment of one's role expectations in the family, community, place of worship, workplace, and other settings. So they also were saying that the environment in which you live is also really important. The way that you feel in your environment, the way that you feel that you contribute to your environment, to the people around you, the way that you move through the world is really important. Overall wellness is a subjective, self-directed, and evolving process that can improve overall health. Wellness is something that we should all be interested in. So why should we study wellness? Wellness is multidimensional. Wellness comprises many domains. The WHO has acknowledged the physical, social, psychological, spiritual. And it's interesting because therapy and psilocybin may address symptoms that are associated with these domains. Wellness is also subjective, and we know that psychedelic experiences are subjective. So to us, it just makes sense that measuring self-reported effects of these subjective experiences makes sense. We also want to study because everybody has it. We have an abundance of indication-specific psychedelic research. However, we're looking at really narrow sample populations. We're looking at people who are cherry-picked for pharmaceutical purposes, people with pure disease. So for example, people who only have depression, people who only have anxiety. I think we know that most people do not have only one condition. Oftentimes people have more than one condition. So this probably isn't representative of the average person. We want to make it the eligibility for our trial to be based on safety, not indication. So an indication is something like depression or anxiety. And as I was saying, normally clinical trials will recruit on the basis that somebody has one of these indications specifically. We've designed this clinical trial so that eligibility is based on safety. So for example, do you have a condition that is contraindicated to take psilocybin? So for example, a cardiovascular condition or a psychotic disorder. If the answer is yes, then perhaps you might not be eligible. However, we're not looking for specific disorders to exclude. So why is studying wellness important? Well, wellness can actually affect your health, your physical health even. The way that you feel about your life really influences your overall health. And we know this because doctors often suggest lifestyle interventions to improve health. The lifestyle interventions that they choose are often targeting domains of wellness. So for example, nutrition to assist your physical wellness, therapy for perhaps social and psychological wellness, exercise and breath work for your physical wellness. These are lifestyle interventions that we know to improve your overall health that are aspects of wellness. Wellness is also important because qualitative data regarding how people feel about the treatments that they receive is really important. Self-reported data is really important. When we think about psychedelic medicine in particular, psychedelic experiences are incredibly subjective and highly qualitative. We have a lot of qualitative clinical data. So for example, how do people score on measurements and scales of depression and anxiety following psilocybin-assisted or psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy? But what about how the treatment is actually making these people feel? Has it improved their lives? In what ways? These are things that numbers can't describe. And so we think it's really important to center patient experiences by really highlighting this qualitative self-reported data. Moving into a bit more into the scientific rationale for this study. Brain plasticity is definitely, or neuroplasticity is definitely very buzzy right now in the field of psychology and psychiatry. And brain plasticity is the process of synapses changing functionally in response to the environment. This is a process that helps us to learn patterns, adapt to change, and cope. You may notice that these items here, learning patterns, adapting to change, and cope, these are things that are negatively affected by a lot of disorders. So for example, depression, anxiety, PTSD. Overwhelmingly, we have seen psilocybin be a topic of conversation when it comes to brain plasticity, because psilocybin is thought to act on the serotonergic system within the prefrontal cortex to modulate plasticity. The prefrontal cortex is a site of higher cognitive function. This is where all of the executive tasks that you need to do throughout the day, the final structure in your brain who gets a say on what the actions you perform are is the prefrontal cortex. So psilocybin seems to have a really powerful effect on coping and decision-making in this area. We also know that therapy affects brain plasticity. A lot of the point of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is to repattern the way that we think about things. And this involves directly changing synaptic function so that we can cope better and adapt to change. Previous studies have looked at how psilocybin and therapy can affect different domains of wellness. So for example, the physical domain, a study by Lies et al. In 2023 looked at how does psilocybin-assisted therapy affect pain, chronic pain in particular, and they found robust improvements in chronic pain. Through the psychological domain, I think we have a lot of evidence here that goes beyond just the studies that I've listed, but existential distress, robust reductions in existential distress following psychedelic-assisted therapy. And lastly, in the social domain, improved relationships and interconnectedness within patients, cancer patients who received psilocybin-assisted therapy. So our question is, why don't we look at all of these domains at the same time, particularly under the wellness umbrella, which takes into account all of these domains? So how do we measure wellness? The questionnaires that we're going to be using are completely self-report. So the participants will be filling out these questionnaires themselves, and they are directly giving us the data. The questionnaires that we'll be using include, but are not limited to, the SF-36, which is a questionnaire for overall quality of life, the PROMIS version 2.1, which is again looking at overall quality of life, but also gives us really good insight into how people perceive the treatment that they are being given. So for example, do you like taking this medication? How does taking this medication make you feel? Questions of this nature. These are questions that don't often get asked in pharmaceutical funded research because oftentimes the patient experience with taking pharmaceutical drugs isn't great. And so they are not inclined to ask these kind of questions. But these are questions that, given the stakeholder funded model that we are employing for the PsilWell trial, these are questions that we're able to ask. And lastly, we're looking at the WHO QOL, which is the WHO Quality of Life 100, which is a long form survey that goes into all of the WHO recognized domains of wellness. What's really interesting about this questionnaire is that it is subdivided into these categories, which means that as part of our analysis, we'll be able to determine exactly which domains of wellness are most impacted by psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. So why is the PsilWell study different? First and foremost, as mentioned in this webinar series, this is a participant-funded model. The participation fees, which in the case of this clinical trial, $4,500 Canadian, cover the full cost of the investigational treatment. And as well, there's no traditional private investors, which means that we're asking questions truly in the pursuit of knowledge that's going to help people. As well, this is completely open source data. Once the study has been completed, we will be publishing these open source. We're very open to sharing because we are very much against the data silos that are currently prevailing in psychedelic research. Next up, we're really working with a people-first approach. We are really championing self-reported subjective data collection through the use of these questionnaires. We want to hear exactly from people's mouths and, you know, what do you think about this treatment and how does it make you feel? We've also designed this trial in consultation with community, clinicians, and participants, so all of our stakeholders. And lastly, indication-free recruitment makes PsilWell really different. Eligibility, again, is based on safety, not indication. And because of this, we are casting a really wide net. This is really interesting because most of the time in clinical research, you do not want to cast a wide net. You want to select a really tiny, narrow sample population. However, in our case, we really celebrate the diversity of our participants. We want to show that people from a wide range of backgrounds and life experiences can experience this investigational treatment and be able to show results from that across a whole bunch of different heterogeneous populations. Finally, indications aren't always predictors of who will be the best to respond to a treatment. As I mentioned, clinical trials almost always are completed within a specific patient pool. And so when the drug is released to market, eventually people who don't have that indication are going to end up trying it, and we don't really have data on the safety of that. When we do research in this way by casting a wide net, we get that diversity within these regulated environments. So getting into the study itself, here is a broad overview. So the full title of PsilWell is Evaluating the Effect of Psilocybin-Assisted Group Therapy on Measures of Wellness in Well and Unwell Individuals. So this is also something that makes PsilWell unique, is that we are looking for people who are well and unwell. Normally, studies are looking for people who are sick only. However, we want to see and compare and contrast the effect of psilocybin-assisted group therapy in everyone. This is a phase 2 study with 120 possible participants, so 20 therapy groups in total. And the intervention that we're using here is group therapy. Group therapy will be done in groups of 6, and participants will receive 3 preparatory group therapy sessions and 3 integration group therapy sessions. Obviously, in the middle of this, we have the medicine dosing. Participants will receive 30 milligrams of psilocybin and an optional 5 milligram top up. So what are our study objectives? Our primary objective is to see the effect of psilocybin-assisted group therapy on self-reported effects of wellness. And to do this, we're going to be using those measures that I talked about earlier, the WHO QOL and the PROPAR. The secondary objectives is to evaluate the safety and feasibility of this treatment. And to do this, we will be using the CSSRS, the SF-36, and we'll also be monitoring safety and feasibility. And lastly, exploratory objectives. We would like to investigate the relationship between some of these measures up here and response to psilocybin and other baseline measures, such as socioeconomic details and demographic information. So as a visual to this, this is our study flow. So individuals are asked to pre-screen with us by submitting a form online, and then they'll do a phone call. If they're successful here, then they will screen on site with a nurse and a research coordinator. And then at baseline, if they have successfully screened, then they will enroll and pay participation fees. From there, participation in the study begins, where we have these 3 preparatory therapy sessions, followed by the dosing session, 3 integration sessions, and then 1 final assessment. This is completed virtually, and participants complete much of the same questionnaires that they completed throughout the course of the study at this final visit. As for regulatory compliance, we are proud to say that PsilWell is Health Canada approved. It is also cleared by an independent research ethics board, or REB. And of course, as all clinical trials go, safety monitoring is always ongoing. We have independent monitoring of our trial data, and we also oblige by all regulatory oversight required by Health Canada and our REB. So who can participate in this study? I will start off by saying that these criteria are not exhaustive, and screening with our team is necessary to completely assess your eligibility, but these are some high-level key points. So for inclusion criteria, we are looking for people who are between 18 and 65 years old, who are able to attend in-person visits at our clinic site in Victoria, BC. We are asking that people be medically stable. You may be in treatment for a condition, but overall your health would be stable. We're looking for folks who are fluent in English, reading, writing, and speaking, who have reliable access to a smartphone, tablet, or computer to complete online forms and questionnaires. As for key exclusion criteria, pregnant and or breastfeeding persons cannot participate. Unfortunately, at this time, taking antidepressants is contraindicated, as are illicit substances and or psychoactive substances. You would be excluded if you have cardiovascular conditions or a diagnosis of a psychotic disorder, or if you have a first-degree relative with a psychotic disorder. You would be ineligible if you have severe PTSD. Mild to moderate PTSD can be admissible. However, this is at the discretion of the study team, specifically our RN and PI. And if you're somebody who has a history of seizures, then perhaps the study might not be for you. We are happy to explore your eligibility together over the phone, and I'll show you how you can contact us in just a bit. So what is participation like in this trial? So as I mentioned, we start with screening and enrollment, and this just looks like answering questions over the phone and then coming on site for a visit with our RN and research coordinator. You would provide informed consent and pay the participation fee. Then you would begin your preparatory group therapy, which again happens in groups of 6 and is about 120 minutes each week. You get 3 preparatory therapy sessions, followed by the psilocybin dosing day, which takes about 6 to 8 hours. You will experience psilocybin with your group mates with full support from a physician, therapists, and co-sitters. You will receive 3 sessions of group integration therapy. And lastly, you will complete your final assessments. Throughout the course of the study, you will be completing questionnaires, those questionnaires that we went through earlier. So in total, as a participant, the time commitment looks like about 9 weeks, and the total cost is $4,500. So how can you get involved? Recruitment is open in Victoria, BC, and we invite you to go to the TheraPsil website, specifically the clinical trial webpage. Read through the information that you see there, and at the very bottom is a webpage form where you can submit your interest. Once you submit that form, we will get in contact with you to begin pre-screening. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation, for tuning into our webinar. It's been so amazing to talk about this work that we've been honestly, we've been working on this for a minute, so it's super exciting to be able to bring this to the community. Super excited to discuss this with the community as well, and I'd like to open the floor for Q&A.
If anyone has any chats, feel free to either just speak up, raise a hand, or throw them into the chat box. Because I can also throw a question out there for you, Kamaya, but oh, Caroline, you beat me to it.
Hi, Spencer. Nice to meet you. And Kamaya,
Nice to meet you.
thank you for hosting and sharing. So yeah, so just as a little like feedback, I'm here because I'm curious about other kinds of research models, and I'm interested about the stakeholder-focused model, in particular because I've had so I'm a registered social worker and I have a private practice, and I've had the opportunity to do some ketamine learning experiences and some other training where I feel confident supporting folks who are preparing for and are looking for integration support while they're seeking plant medicine and psilocybin, different things, ketamine. So I've had an opportunity to work with folks who've been part of the research trials, the clinical research trials, and it's been really interesting to see some of the places where you're pointing out the importance for a different framework, a different model, actually show up in my therapeutic relationships, right? So places where the indication based protocol for selection can be really for folks who are seeking support in some way. There can be a performative aspect where like they're siloing themselves into a particular pathology so that they can participate. And when the questionnaires are done, when they're doing the questionnaires, they've reported back to me that they weren't always honest because it would exclude them from a second opportunity. So they were kind of working the system, so to speak. They were really hopeful that this that psilocybin or ketamine or whatever MDMA that they had been working with would be a magic bullet, like a magic. It would work magic for them, and if it didn't do so in the first opportunity, and they wanted to have an opportunity to do a second one, they wouldn't be so honest, and they would say what the research team would want to hear. So I had a really clear, well, patient-centered view of how these research trials can be skewed a lot of the time. So that the results to me, when I started to really look at them, I started to question them in terms of like what was really happening on the ground with the motivations for the folks that were participating. And what I feel hopeful about is in particularly like if I have an opportunity to sort of send people this way, is that they can experience something that is a lot more geared towards their overall wellness without having to have that performability or that sort of they need to fit in within a space to be selected, or that maybe would hopefully bring up like a more trusting experience for them. I had a couple of clients say that, in particular, someone who was going to an MDMA trial for a PTSD, who had experienced quite a bit of trauma in their background. When they arrived for the preparation session, they were the therapists who were supposed to be there didn't show up. So the principal investigator and the other research assistant were sort of running the preparation, which was they had sort of said, would you share with us your trauma? Like, what are your experiences of prior trauma? Without having an understanding of how to kind of support that person's need to feel safe in that disclosure, because they weren't trained therapists. And so I don't think we always see that these things can happen, that like, sometimes, it's hard to hear, but that the therapist part of this equation didn't show up that day and this person really suffered. So had a really, really profound setback in their mental health following that preparation session. So things like that, I don't think everybody gets a clear picture of, and it's important it is kind of why I'm here, because I'd like to sort of shine a light myself and the work that I do in some way, like get it out there that there are some problems with the current model of how research is done, outside of just, the obvious ones that we have, sort of pharmaceutical bias for getting a marketable product, right? But that there's other things that are happening to the clients themselves that is really affecting their safety and the authenticity of what's really happening. Anyway, just thought I'd share that because I've just had some neat experiences with that, and it kind of, I'm hoping, validates kind of what you're doing as important.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I think it shares a really important viewpoint from the participants as well from clinicians, which I think is really important. It's why we think it's so important to center these stakeholder experiences so that we can design trials that are safe for everyone and that really are going to pave a way to legal use that looks correct, looks a way that we can all feel accountable to. So we think that that's really important. And I think it's really interesting that you highlighted that patients perhaps feel like they have to perform in order to continue receiving treatment in existing clinical trials. And I think that that adds kind of perhaps another win, if I toot our own horn here for this model, in the way that we are actually accountable to our participants in the design of the trial. And so that kind of eliminates the need for our participants to feel like they have to perform a certain way in order to participate in the research. I think this is really great because people can freely express themselves, and we're truly getting at the essence of, the answers that we're trying to derive here. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you too. Yeah, thank you.
That kind of led to one of the questions I had for you, and maybe you can help answer this, is, when you design a study where stakeholders are being paid, like in a lot of clinical trials, wondering how that affects outcomes, how it affects participation in studies. How does that change when now we're flipping it and the stakeholder is actually paying to join a study? What sort of things have we had to think about? What does ethics said about stakeholder-funded trials and how it might affect research?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of times when we hear about fees associated with clinical trials, I think it's almost always in the reverse, where they're being paid to the participant. And in fact, this is a huge source of bias. Regulatory bodies and guideline, academic institutions that provide guidelines for clinical research, they almost always have a section in there talking about what you need to consider when you're paying your participants. And it's very regulated. When it goes through the REB, they're very conscious of the amount that's being paid to participants, the method in which it is being paid. So for example, cash, gift card, or a physical item. And this remuneration is very important. And I think it's important to highlight that we did not have even half of the pushback as I have had when I have worked in settings where we have applied for clinical research where you give participants money. I would say we haven't even had half of the pushback because realistically, the risk is so different. And I think the risk is also at varying degrees. So when we were working with Health Canada and with the regulatory bodies towards this protocol, it was really important that we just had a really clear fee structure that would make sense to the regulators, that made sense to us to run, and that we could explain to the participants. And the reason for this is because informed consent is the king of clinical research. As long as everybody's aware of exactly what's happening, what the contingencies are to that, then that's the risk. That's where it's been mitigated, is through informed consent. There is, of course, the opportunity for bias, people who want to see a certain result for themselves. We think that this is sort of mitigated by the fact that people aren't being kind of coerced in the way that Caroline was sharing into behaving a certain way so that they can receive treatment. People who are eligible for this are eligible truly not because of diagnostic reasons. So they don't really need to perform any way in particular. And the only person that they're accountable to have certain results is themselves. And for this, we can't ask people, we can't do anything about that. That's also just the nature of research, and that's going to exist in every clinical trial, no matter the model. But yeah, I think it's been a really interesting journey to see, I think, the difference between a participant paid clinical trial versus a trial where participants are paid.
Thank you. And Caroline added here, what were some of the most challenging parts of clearing REB and maybe Health Canada too? What were the most challenging hurdles in the application protocol?
I would say the most challenging hurdles were actually around our eligibility criteria, because we wanted to remain as open as possible. And so the place where we received a little bit of pushback was allowances that we were making that perhaps other studies in the literature are not making. So yeah, I think that's where we had a little bit of trouble. But even then, I would say that we had a really not a, I don't know if a great time is the right word to use, but I think we had a good experience going through the REP and Health Canada.
For sure. And maybe something we can add there too. I don't know if it was challenging getting it by REB, but certainly consideration was, there are a lot of aspects of a clinical trial that are overbuilt, and you start to question, what are the risks and rewards of adding these things on? So I know you can always add more metrics, you can always add more tests, you can always add more, safety measures and protocols. But sometimes it may not be necessary given the safety profile. Sometimes the added costs of research, when they're stacked on the patient, you have to wonder, are we actually increasing the cost too much where it's out of reach? Or are we, trying to lower the cost so much so we're actually putting patients at risk? So I can also add that was definitely a balance, and in a huge aspect of the trial was what do we add and is necessary both for inclusion criteria and also for parts of the study, and what things can we, take away and make do without in order to keep the cost down. I think cost really is just one of those things that is incredibly important on a stakeholder-funded trial. You can add as much as you want when you've got millions of dollars in funding from an academic institution or shareholders, but not always with patients. Another question here from Tracy. So no challenge re participants paying to be in the study? Not really. I wouldn't say that it was a challenge. Kamai, would you say there was any challenge there?
No. No, yeah.
Yeah. And again, I think just what came out of this was there is actually precedent for it. And if you look out there, I know I'd seen some articles, but there are articles that discuss this in depth, both those that are for it and those who show its merits, but also those that share a lot of limitations to this model. From Michelle, were there any indication from Health Canada that they would be open to this model moving forward for other psychedelic medicines? If so, what insights can you offer for their considerations? So I would just say that I don't think this model was limited to psilocybin. I don't think it's because it was psilocybin that this was allowed. So my understanding would be that this would be totally fine for other psychedelics. The stakeholder-funded model could even perhaps be applied outside of psychedelics to things like, I don't know, experimental or other cancer medicines that similarly are unpatentable, or other treatments out there that just have fallen out of patent or are already used for other indications. So I would say the stakeholder-funded model, if that's the model we're talking about, no, it's not limited to psilocybin at all.
I see Tracy asked which REB that we used. We were using the Canadian Shield REB. And I also saw that Bonnie has a question. Can participants claim part of this through private insurance? This is something that we are currently investigating. My cautious answer at this moment is no, just because we haven't tested that. However, we encourage participants to submit a claim for the therapy portion, preparatory and integration, to their insurance to see what's possible. We're happy to provide itemized receipts and therapist insurance receipts for people to try this out. I see Caroline has asked, are there opportunities for folks who aren't able to access this trial due to financial constraints? At this time, we are unable to offer financial assistance, just given the pilot and just really this is our first clinical trial given this model. However, that's something that we are really working towards in the future for future trials as scholarships, as well as pro bono access to equity deserving groups.
Yeah, I'll comment on that quick. That stakeholder model again. The patient is what I'll call like the primary stakeholder. They're the ones who really stand to benefit the most, perhaps from the treatment. And as a class, you could say, are the class that benefit the most. Any of us at one time might be a patient for any specific patient or stakeholder-funded trial. But outside of that, I think the next perhaps biggest stakeholder could be the nonprofits or charities in the space. So this is something that I'm working on a lot right now, is applying to different grants and different funding rounds and really like selling to charities. Because, this whole study that we're running costs something like $500,000. And if it was, if there's a wellness charity out there, let me know who they are. And if they wanted to put forward $200,000, that could decrease the cost per patient pretty much in half. And perhaps that doesn't need to be applied equally to all patients. Maybe that's, just for those who can't afford access. And that could be equally, applied to a study for end-of-life distress, for, a charity more focused on that, alcohol use disorder, I don't know, maybe strokes or neurological disorders, if there's certain uses or applications for psychedelics for them. So really, I think those organizations that do fundraising, donations, and want to accelerate research, they can be a stakeholder that can drive down the cost for participants. Because again, like we do acknowledge this does cost a lot, and the patient stakeholders do not need to be the only ones flipping the bill for this. Could include nonprofits, governments, if they ever felt so inclined as well.
We have another question from Bonnie. Do participants have to take the synthetic form of psilocybin? At this time, synthetic is probably, I think, to my knowledge, the only thing that you'll find in clinical trials, because the product itself needs to be GMP, which natural psilocybin cannot be GMP at this time, just given the options that we have. So we are using extract psilocybin for this study.
Another question I see here is, does it require a nonprofit company at the head of the research? I don't think so. What we've done in the research is we were partnered. So this is Hippo, TheraPsil as well, but there are other partners as well that are not nonprofits, and that's totally fine, like Filament and Creo and SabiMind too. So I believe, but I haven't really tested that. It's more like the push towards open science and towards propagating more research that benefits patients and larger stakeholder group that allows this to be done. But otherwise, it doesn't need to be a nonprofit heading it.
This has been really great discussion, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing your comments and your concerns.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining. If anyone ever has any other questions, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, have a great night, and thank you.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentations.
Hey, thank you, Ian. Take care.
Thanks so much, both of you.
If someone is making a charitable donation, can that be done just to the whole research project and not to the individual